He's the only genius I ever met.
People talk about him being a guru, but what he's really been very good at doing is understanding the forces that are already at work and seeing patterns that other people haven't seen.
The result? An unrivaled career spanning the 20th and 21st centuries.
There's been, in my mind, no management thinker like Peter.
Meet Peter Drucker and learn why he's called the father of modern management.
Okay.
Hi, Peter.
Here you are again.
How you doing?
Yeah.
You doing good?
I'm spoiling film.
No, you look great.
Hi, Deborah. I haven't said hello to you.
If you ask him what he is, he says he's a writer. This writer has had more influence on the lives of human beings than any other writer of this century.
Peter, we're glad you wore your name tag. We're glad you wore your name tag. Congratulations.
When you think about Peter, he's sort of like the Babe Ruth and Ted Williams of baseball because of his sustained excellence and just the consistency of his insights into the practice of management.
If you say that Lenin is the architect of centralized power, you'd have to say that Drucker is the architect of decentralized power. The whole structure of modern capitalism.
He starts, I think, with a premise that what his life's work has been about is releasing the energy and the potential in people, and he's developed a management philosophy that enables managers to do that.
All the basic ideas. How do you get the most out of people? How do you treat people in the workplace? How do you pay them? How do you reward them? How do you motivate them? All that stuff is Peter Drucker 101.
Andrea, close to Andrea.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you.
And thanks for everything you have been doing.
He is an endearing human being. There is no one who has ever spent any time with Peter Drucker who hasn't said, I'm so glad I had the opportunity, the privilege of meeting with Peter Drucker.
Peter Drucker has continued to live the same kind of active life he has pursued for well over 90 years. At the Drucker School of Management, part of the Claremont Graduate University in California, he is revered as an engaging professor.
30 years of success or 50 create certainties. Look at Coke in the troubles it's in, because it is incredibly hard to slough off what has worked for 50 years, or even to be critical about it. In other words, you know all the answers and you don't ask the questions anymore.
When you go into Peter's classroom, it's like he's talking to nobody else, and you're in there and you just tune into him. And as you're listening to him, he takes you through history, he takes you through the case, he takes you through all of his experiences and the people that he was with, and he teaches on about 4 different levels at the same time. And it changes your life. It changes how you think, it changes how you view people.
Drucker still maintains a consulting practice that began in the 1940s. His clients have included some of the largest corporations and nonprofits in the country. One of his current clients is A.G. Lafley, CEO of Procter & Gamble.
Peter taught, and I believe very deeply, that you have to play from your strengths. And one of the issues that confronted us a few years ago is we were playing as hard to overcome our weaknesses as we were to leverage our strengths.
Since Drucker has traveled infrequently in recent years, Lafley visited the celebrated consultant at his modest house in Claremont, California. His impressions of Drucker?
Curious, bright eyes, twinkle in his eye. Sometimes you have the feeling he's thinking a step or two ahead of you, and he's asking you questions or expressing thoughts and giving you time to understand where he is so you can move to him and discuss that next thought.
Drucker is the author of 35 books and hundreds of articles on management, society, and world affairs. Yet he's never rested on his accomplishments. He's always looking ahead.
The work is never done with Peter. He will write something or do something, and he will immediately declare it obsolete. So he's very open to new ideas, new influences, and to updating his own work, which is what keeps him so current.
And I asked him what the most important thing that has happened in China the last 3 to 5 years. And he thought about 5 seconds and then said that we now consider owning an automobile a necessity and not a luxury. That is what globalization means. It is not an economic event, it's a psychological phenomenon.
One longtime client calls Drucker the rock star of management consultants. Among his millions of fans are some of the most successful executives and management consultants in the world.
Wherever I travel, it doesn't matter. I can go to Poland, I can go to Peru, and there are people who say, Peter Drucker has had the greatest impact upon my life, my career, my business. It is amazing.
Peter probably taught me how to ask questions and ask them intelligently and question myself about things and question others in an appropriate way. But to try to understand what one is doing, why one is doing that, okay, and what one expects from that. Now, is that philosophy? Is that management? Is that life?
The management consultant is a big masquerade. He's the most profound, pragmatic philosopher that I've ever known of.
Peter's teachings and the person both have a humane aspect to them that you don't expect in management education. And he talks in terms of people's responsibilities and their contributions and their dignity.
And I think one of the great geniuses that Peter has is this capacity to take these intergalactic thoughts, which he has, and really understands, and bring them down, and then, like a laser beam, focus them on a specific moment and time and a specific executive in a specific company and what could be done.
Management around the world owes a debt of gratitude to somebody who devoted his life to clarifying the role of people, the role of an organization in our society. And Peter, I think, more than anybody, did that job most effectively.
Peter Ferdinand Drucker.
For his contributions as the father of modern management, he recently received the Medal of Freedom, the highest honor bestowed by the White House.
Peter Drucker's prolific writings have greatly benefited our nation and significantly influenced the shape of our society and the modern business world. The United States honors his extraordinary accomplishments.
As Columbus discovered America, Drucker discovered management. Professional managers had long been in charge of America's corporations, but little had been written about them until Drucker arrived on the American business scene in the 1940s.
Up till then, business had been seen only as economics and not as a human and social organization. That's the main thing I learned and taught.
How did a European immigrant intellectual become the guru of American corporate management? The story begins in Vienna before World War I. Peter Ferdinand Drucker was born here in 1909, when the city was still the cosmopolitan heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
It was normal that you got a very broad education in art, in history, in philosophy, and that you spoke 5 to 10 languages.
His father was a high civil servant in the Austro-Hungarian government, and his wife was a highly educated woman with special education in medical matters.
The Druckers' comfortable suburban home hosted regular gatherings of Vienna's foremost politicians, intellectuals, musicians, and scientists.
They would have economic evenings in which the subjects would be about the economy and finance at the dinner table. They would have
medical evenings in which eminent medical personages would come and talk about medical science. There would be literary evenings. There would be evenings on international politics. And in short, he picked up a matchless education, not just knowledge, but a sort of style toward knowledge, a sort of inbred worldliness and knowingness about human nature, about how things fit together.
But World War I and its aftermath of economic and political upheaval left Vienna impoverished, looking backwards to its former glory.
I grew up very conscious of the society around me, very unhappy. I hated the Vienna of the 20s in which I grew up and fled as soon as I could.
At 18, he left home for Germany to work as a clerk in a Hamburg trading company. A year later, he moved to Frankfurt, where he entered university and got a job as a journalist on one of the city's largest daily newspapers. One of his first articles reported on the stock market crash in October 1929. Drucker remembers that his editor-in-chief was a demanding mentor.
At 5 minutes to 7, you will put on my desk the second and third editorial. I write the first one, 1,500 words on domestic affairs. You write one, 1,200 words on foreign affairs and 900 words on business. And I said, who will give me the topics? And they said, that's your job.
As a journalist, Drucker covered the decline of German democracy and the rise of the Nazis.
Living through the years of the emergence of Hitler in Germany as a very active journalist, I can claim to have been one of the very first ones who saw Hitler as the real danger. What made me see the danger of Hitler? I was simply scared. First, I also had read Mein Kampf, which no educated person was willing to read. And I realized that Hitler meant every word of it.
One of the major lights for him has always been the menace of centralized power, whether it be communist or Nazi. He saw the danger of that kind of tyranny very early and recognized that it was not a place he could live in.
In 1933, soon after Hitler became German Chancellor, Drucker fled to London. Here he found work as a securities analyst at a private investment bank under a man he ranks as one of his 3 tough bosses.
My 3 tough bosses did not accept that there are limitations to what you can do. They all 3 very different people had in common that they expected, demanded, finished work of high standards and did not settle for anything else.
In London, Drucker re-met Doris Schmitz, his wife of more than 65 years. They had been students together in Frankfurt. Immediately after their marriage in 1937, they set off for the United States. His employment?
Feature writer for a group of British papers, and traveled all over the country. And the country was incredibly exciting in 1937, 38. So much was going on. The climate was so totally different. In Europe, the only hope was to go back to 1913. In this country, the depression, but nobody looked back. It looked forward. That was the tremendous excitement.
In 1939, Drucker published his first book, The End of Economic Man. It was an analysis of the rise of fascist totalitarianism. The book was praised by many critics, including Winston Churchill in the London Times.
One of the continuing and dominant chords of my work have been the balance between continuity and change. And when continuity is completely cut, which was what the Nazis did, then you have disaster. But if continuity becomes overwhelming, then you have stagnation and also catastrophe. That constant balance, which makes me neither a liberal nor a conservative, but unpopular on both sides.
In the early 1940s, Drucker started a teaching career at Bennington College in Vermont. He taught political science and philosophy.
He had a way of reaching at a person, hitting at their core, and at the same time giving them the sense that they really could do better and they knew better, and that he would help them in the process. But he was quite a teacher.
In 1942, he published a second book, The Future of Industrial Man. Here, he described the industrial corporation as a form of social organization that offered the possibility of worker solidarity and cooperation, a new kind of community.
He wrote in general about factories, and in general about industrial society, and in general about big business, as concept in The Future of Industrial Man. He had never been inside such an institution. And someone from GM called him and said, would you like to do essentially an in-house study of how General Motors operates?
And when Peter stepped back and looked at General Motors, which was the first industrial organization he looked at, he began to see that within the modern industrial organization, there was work called management, which was the work of making this whole operate effectively. And that really was the first time, I think, that anyone had stepped back and said, how is it that we think about this as a whole? And what are the responsibilities? What are the important tasks? What's the real work of making all of these people work together in a productive way?
From his General Motors experience, Drucker published a groundbreaking book, The Concept of the Corporation.
Well, one major conclusion that had the greatest impact was the importance of decentralization. That then became, over the next 30 or 40 years, the organizing principle worldwide of the large corporation. And another one was the need for the systematic development of executives. Practically all our graduate business schools and the executive management programs came out of that book. Its impact was that for the first time, somebody had looked and analyzed and described business as organized activity and not as buying cheap and selling high.
So he saw this institution, which everyone was sort of taking for granted. And, you know, people had said, well, a manager's just a boss. Well, I've always said bosses. What the hell is the difference here? And he said, no, this is a discipline. This is an institution. It's not like being an overseer, because he can't. He can't look at how you're doing. There are too many people involved. And he saw management as the application of mind to work. And this person, the manager, becomes for him a kind of culture hero.
The Concept of the Corporation was a bestseller and launched Drucker on a consulting practice that included some of the largest corporations in the country. In the 1950s and 1960s, when American industry dominated the world, General Electric, IBM, Citibank, and many others sought out Peter Drucker.
I mean, companies begin to call him and say, you seem to be the only person who's figured this out in the big picture. Can you come and give us, look at our problems and give us advice? And he sort of becomes the first management consultant.
My consulting work is my laboratory. It's where I do where I learn. And writing is my profession.
Out of his vast experience as a management consultant, in 1954, Drucker published his most famous book, The Practice of Management.
Well, I wrote The Practice of Management because there was no book on management. Very simple. I had been working by the time for 10 years or so, consulting, and I had begun to teach management for 2 or 3 years, and there simply was nothing, or very little. And so I kind of sat down and wrote it, very conscious of the fact that I was laying the foundations for a discipline.
In The Practice of Management, which was, I think, probably his first popular book about management, Peter makes the comment that there is no business without a customer. You think, well, what's so big deal, you know? Well, it's not. I mean, it is a big deal. It's because that, in its essence, is both the beginning of what we would come to know as a marketing mindset. It's the mindset of someone who says, what my organization is about is satisfying the needs and wants of people who are not part of the organization. It's not about what we can do internally. It's about the results that we have out in the world, the impact that we have, whether someone else wants what it is that we're doing.
Management is a practice. The title, let me say, was a manifesto. Management is not a science, it is not an art, it is a practice, like medicine.
In the end, he says it's about treating human beings well. That's what management is. Getting the best out of them. And you don't do that by threatening them with the fear of losing their jobs. You don't get them that by treating them like robots. His ideal manager is a symphony orchestra conductor who obviously has the score furnished by the composer/finance people, Stockholm, but who's got great interpretive freedom with how he does it, and who depends crucially upon the professionalism and performance of each member of that orchestra. The worker is not a cost, he says, but a resource. If he's a cost, you try to cut him and limit him and deal with him that way. If he's a resource, you want to tap him. You want to let what he has flow out and to your improvement. Not only will that make you a better company, but it'll make the society better because people will get those non-economic satisfactions.
Many of Drucker's management insights have become so much a part of mainstream business thinking that we forget how original they were when they were first published in the 1950s and 60s. But Drucker's vision of a humane, collaborative workplace that respects the dignity of each individual employee has not been embraced by most American corporations.
American managers bred Drucker, and some of them applied Drucker, but he was really taken to heart in Japan. And one of the things that happened was that companies organized along Druckerian lines where the employee was a resource, not a cost, beat the pants off our financialized companies.
I had more impact on management in Japan, much more than I had in this country or any other place, because the Japanese took these ideas of mine seriously, turned them into lifetime employment, trying to make the company the center of the community.
Many American executives learned their Drucker principles the hard way, from strong Japanese competitors that shook up American management in the 1970s and 80s. During his long life, Peter Drucker has refused to stay on a single track. Acknowledged as the master of management, he has continued to write about all human endeavors, even Japanese art, a subject on which he is considered a world expert. Using his vast knowledge of history, economics, literature, and society, Drucker has taught managers about the fast-changing world in which they live and work. The result has been a constant stream of books, including his latest, Managing in the Next Society.
Peter has a way of calling us back to looking at the world around us and reminding us how important that world is, and that the changes in that world can have deep and profound effects on the most well-run, the most able organization, and the most able people.
So he says to the manager, look out there. Okay, and in these big picture books like The New Society, Landmarks of Tomorrow, The Age of Discontinuity, and others, he says, let's look out there. Not just at the customer, although that's important, but at the world around the customer, at society and how it is changing and where it might go. And you ask, you know, what is it that made these books and other books of his so prescient, and where did he get his reputation for having the future in his bones? Well, one of the things he looked at as a social analyst was demography, just the record of births and deaths, and all of that, which we tend to assume that everybody knows about. Well, he was one of the first people to really look at it as the basis for social analysis.
When Drucker looked at the demographics in the advanced industrial nations in the 1960s, he saw the emergence of a new kind of economy. 90% of all the scientists and technologists who had ever lived were then alive and at work. The largest single group of workers in the 1960 U.S. Census were professional, managerial, and technical people. In The Age of Discontinuity, published in 1969, and some say his greatest work of social analysis, Drucker wrote about what he called the knowledge economy and the knowledge workers who would dominate this new age.
One of the important things of this book is that I think it was the first book that pointed to the tremendous demographic changes as critical. The change in the workforce, the shift from capital to knowledge as the key resource, what we now call globalization.
In another provocative book, The Pension Fund Revolution, published in 1976, Drucker focused attention on a development that was changing the face of American capitalism.
First, I showed that the American financial and capital market had been totally changed by the emergence of the pension fund as the main, largest single owner of the large corporations. That as a result of this, the society had totally changed because what the 19th century had assumed and the 20th century also accepted, that capital is here and workers are there, they now become one and the same person. And that is a fundamental change in the structure of society.
So Peter says, wait a minute, if the workers in their pension funds own the means of are starting to own the means, what are the implications?
So you will see rapid power shifts, just as suddenly 15 years ago the new institutional investors became the power, and shareholder sovereignty came in. You may, within a few years, already you see a very sharp shift of the pendulum, where the knowledge workers as employees will become the power source.
What he's done has been to always be the pioneer, seeing where the next society is. It's appropriate that his book would be that. And it's the joy of that discovery that drives Peter.
I never see anything in the future. I don't believe in it. I look out the window. I look for things that have already happened, but have not yet had their consequences and are not yet perceived.
In The Age of Discontinuity, and in later books of social analysis, Drucker explored the requirements of a knowledge economy.
If knowledge is the key entity, the dynamic force that will decide whether your business fails or not, that will decide whether this society fails or not, then certain things follow. Education has to be the central social activity. Education not just as a matter of school, but as a matter, but lifelong learning, continuous learning. Peter is one of the first people to talk about this as a social necessity.
Drucker himself has pursued a wide-ranging reading program throughout his life, his own rigorous brand of lifelong learning.
Every few years I need to have a part of my reading and in a systematic and with a focus on an area where I like to learn enough to understand. The last 2 years, and I'm about halfway through, I'm rereading all of Shakespeare.
As a teacher, Drucker has changed the thinking of generations of businessmen and women within the classroom and through his consulting practice. Investment banker John Veronis was a student of Drucker's at New York University in the 1950s.
One of the early things I heard Peter say is, don't confuse motion with progress. As simple as that. And that almost became my headline on a daily basis for almost anything I did. And I would ask myself, am I confusing motion with progress? Am I busy but not productive? Am I busy and directionless? I lived with that credo.
GE's former CEO, Jack Welch, remembers his first meeting with Peter Drucker, a week after he had taken over the top job in 1981.
Reg Jones brought Peter to New York, asked Peter to come to New York, and just to chat with me about his philosophy. Peter had worked for GE over a long period of time, and Reg just wanted me to become familiar with him. So we sat in Reg's office in New York, and I listened to him.
And he told Jack Welch, unless you are number one or number two in whatever business you're in, aircraft engines, whatever it may be, get out of it. And this is a very simple lesson. It's not complicated. And Jack Welch followed this advice ruthlessly, getting rid of everything that didn't follow Drucker's formula. And that is really what drove General Electric into being the most successful American corporation, perhaps in the world, during the last 20 years. It was Drucker's simple idea.
He was able to take quite complicated subjects and reduce them to very simple elements. People are sometimes frightened to be too simple. Peter was never too frightened to be simple.
Over the years, while Drucker was consulting with giant corporations like GE, he also was working with small young firms that later became very successful. One was Donaldson, Lufkin, Jenrette, a Wall Street firm that based its growth on the increasing importance of institutional investors. Bill Donaldson was one of the founders of DLJ.
I think one of the greatest things that Peter left with me anyway was the most important decisions you're going to make in building this firm is who you're not going to do business with. And during the heydays of the 1960s and then the beginning of the wheeler dealers and so forth, we had lots of temptations to do business with people that were sort of on a thin ice, and we didn't. And I think that was one of the most important things in the growth of the firm was our decision to not do business with certain people whose demeanor, ethics, and so forth were not compatible with ours.
Another young entrepreneur who sought Drucker's advice was Charles Ellis, whose financial consulting firm, Greenwich Associates, has become a legend in its own right. Ellis remembers his first meeting with Drucker at the Drucker home in California.
We were trying to behave our very best. We were very dignified. We thought we were very important. We were, in our early 40s. And we were really doing something. And we were meeting with Peter Drucker in his home. And then Peter said, well, boys, why don't we relax for a few minutes? Don't you think it'd be a good idea to go for a swim? We didn't have swimming suits. And then he said, obviously, you don't need swimming suits because it's just men here today, so we sort of, you know, you have to go through a couple of rearrangements of your mind to go from, we're meeting with, you know, this magnificent executive consultant. He's meeting with us in the privacy of his own home, and we're going to take off our clothes and go skinny dipping in his pool. But that kind of informality blended in with these august statements of great magnitude. That's a part of why he's so good.
One of the companies that Drucker has advised is ServiceMaster. ServiceMaster is a $3.5 billion multinational corporation in the consumer service industry. Its former CEO, William Pollard, is a longtime Drucker admirer.
Our business primarily involves entry-level positions. We serve today in 12 million homes with one or more of our services. And we are employing over 80,000 people. Our people fairly reflect the diversity of our culture today. We typically are involved not only in training them to do the job, but we often are involved in basic educational process as well. We have a certain segment of our employee base who have yet to even learn the skills of reading English.
Years ago, Pollard invited Drucker to a meeting of the company's board of directors to help them with strategic planning decisions.
Well, his first question of our board was one of his famous questions. What is your business? He listened to various responses from our board. And some of our board members said, well, we're in the cleaning business. Some board said, well, by that time we had already gotten into pest control. So we're in the business of killing bugs. Or we're in the business of taking care of lawns. Or we're in the business of serving hospitals. So we got all these different responses. So after about 10 minutes listening to our board give these different responses of what we did, he told our board something I've never been able to tell the board of directors. He said, you're all wrong. He said, you're simply in the business of training and developing people. You package it all different ways to serve the needs of the customers. But you can't deliver a service without people. You can't deliver a quality service without trained and motivated people. That is your business. And you know, he was right on. It's been a wonderful, constant reminder about what this company is all about.
One of Drucker's strengths as a management thinker is the way he relates the mission and purpose of an organization to its daily activities. This focus has also been a hallmark of his work with America's nonprofit organizations. The 1970s and 80s were a time of crisis for American corporations. Foreign competition and an energy crisis forced U.S. corporations into defensive strategies, including the layoffs of millions of workers. The corporation ceased being the center of life for many American wage earners.
He gives up on corporate capitalism because it's destroyed. In the 80s, it's destroyed by its own lack of performance.
I know a good many managements who do absolutely idiotic things and dangerous things just to look at make the books look good. And in every scandal of the last 10, 15 years, every one of those collapses, management began to fake the books to make themselves look good the next 3 months. The temptation is very great.
Does that worry you?
Yes. Yes. It corrupts management.
He wrote about the betrayal, the way management has betrayed its workers long before Enron was a gleam in Ken Lay's eyes. He could see it happening. The self-dealing, the serving ourselves. He was vastly disappointed.
And where does he turn? Where are workers going to find community and satisfaction? Drucker turns to the nonprofit sector of philanthropies, schools, hospitals, and churches.
Peter notes the phenomenon of voluntarism. He sees it growing everywhere. Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, community groups, soup kitchens. And he's gone back here to Tocqueville, who saw that as one of the
really distinguishing features of American democracy, the voluntary association, people joining up to do things apart from government.
I'm not a volunteer in any one organization, or wasn't, but I have devoted pretty much half of my consulting time to pro bono volunteer work.
From his decades of experience with nonprofit organizations like the American Heart Association, the Red Cross, and the Girl Scouts, Drucker wrote Managing the Nonprofit Organization in 1990.
One of the most interesting aspects of Peter's thinking has been his ability to refine and clarify ideas and to reduce things to essentials that can then become the kind of guiding principles for busy people, which most executives are. So that when he began to talk about working with nonprofits and introducing some of the ideas of management into the world of nonprofit organizations, he could reduce it to, who is my customer? What is the value? What are the results we produce? What's the plan? How will we get there?
He kind of goes right at the central problem with the nonprofits. He says virtue isn't enough. And it's not enough to say we want to be good. You've got to be efficient. You've got to remember the person out there.
Some of you know that I've been saying for a good many years that I consider the Girl Scouts the best managed organization I know. I told that to the reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch this morning, and he was a little surprised.
Frances Hesselbein used to head up the Girl Scouts, one of the largest volunteer organizations in the country. Now she is chairman of the Leader to Leader Institute. She and Drucker have had a long and productive relationship, helping the nonprofit sector manage more effectively.
As Peter says, it all comes down to changing lives. And all the 1,600,000 nonprofits, social sector organizations in this country share that bottom line. It's the financial bottom line that is not the bottom line that drives the organization. And that doesn't mean that you don't have to be, as Peter would remind us, we have to be better financial managers than business or government, because you have no excess. But always the bottom line is changing lives.
Drucker has long been an informal consultant to educator Dolores Cross. Cross has devoted her career to expanding access for minority students at the college level and then helping them become successful there.
It was Peter who encouraged me to move on to a college presidency, specifically Chicago State University. Chicago State University enrolls 1/3 of all the African Americans who attend four-year public institutions in the state of Illinois. These students have backgrounds similar to mine. Many of them come from urban areas, have other things vying for their attention.
Drucker advised Cross to reach out to the corporate community to provide mentors to Chicago State students. But he warned her to make sure that her ideas and vision were shared by others in the organization.
So he wanted you to have a purpose and do whatever you could to make it a shared vision, and then position the institution around your purpose and the vision. But make sure the purpose and the vision relates to the realities of the students, relates to where you are.
Another nonprofit institution that has attracted Drucker's attention is the megachurch. These fast-growing churches have attracted huge numbers of Americans over the past decades.
My interest in the megachurches was as a social phenomenon. I saw them creating community for these young, educated, successful professionals who in 9 cases out of 10 were rootless, came out of the small town or the farm or the working class and now in the big city, and very successful in their work and had no community.
And this is the need or the opportunity which a megachurch exploits.
God wants to use people in your life. You can't grow without others. You need fellowship.
The Saddleback Valley Community Church in Lake Forest, California, has been one of the fastest growing churches in America since it was founded in 1980. Pastor Rick Warren speaks to as many as 17,000 people each weekend, and Saddleback lists more than 53,000 names on its roll of attendees.
We minister to every kind of need: social need, spiritual need, economic need, material needs. We believe that if there's a need, that God meant for the church to meet that need. The people do not exist for the church. The church exists for the community. And so we keep that very clear, and that's why we call this a purpose-driven church. One of the things I love about Peter Drucker is that he helps those of us in nonprofit ministries to figure out what is the purpose. He emphasizes why are you here? If you don't know why you're there, then you have no reason to exist.
He actually finds these institutions. He can find, and he becomes a consultant to them and discovers their importance and tells them why what they're doing is so important. And again, this follows from his big picture analysis. Where is community to be found? Can't be found in the insecure workplace. That's gone. Careers are yesterday. So where are people going to find a rich civic life? Through the megachurch.
And the way we do this is what we call our lay ministries. On a typical weekend, there'll be about 18,000 people coming out of these facilities, and this patio will be covered with tables from up to 196 different ministries. These people care for all the different needs. You name a problem, Saddleback tries to meet that need in the community. We divorce care, people who are going through problems with their children, people who are have someone in jail, a loved one in jail, people who are parents of Down syndrome children. You name an area, any kind of support group you could imagine. We would have ministering to people, and they can come out and get information on that. But it all goes back to the purpose. What is the mission? And the mission of our organization, the bottom line of the church, is change lives.
In 1989, Drucker published an article in the Harvard Business Review. It was called, "What Business Can Learn from Nonprofits."
And the argument that he made there very simply was that because nonprofits had to work so much with volunteers and had to learn how to motivate them, organize them, harness their motivation, and get them to be productive, when it was purely voluntary, they could walk out any moment, would be prophetic for business organizations whose greatest resource were the people who walked out the door every night carrying all of their tools with them in their heads.
In his work with the social sector, he had at last found institutions that offered a true sense of community and respect for the individual.
Peter had this vision of people as individuals, but always respect for people, civility, good manners. And in the end, he really helped all of us understand that in the end, our people are our greatest asset.
Okay. I got stuck. Just in time. You take your place there behind. Gentlemen in the back row, if I get anyone to move a half step this way. Okay.
Must be sure that we have
Wonderful to see you. How nice, Lucia.
Ever since 1971, Drucker has been a professor and guiding presence at the Peter F. Drucker School of Management in Claremont, California. November is reunion time at the school bearing Drucker's name, a time for alumni to revisit a favorite professor.
Another friend. Peter, good to see you again.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
What are you doing these days?
Well, they call it running a company. Huh? They call it running a software company. Okay.
Alumni keep coming back, and they send him lots of notices, but this one occasion once a year is really special. They fly in from the East Coast or sometimes from abroad to be able to celebrate his birthday, be here, have their picture taken with him. They bring him presents and all sorts of other tokens of appreciation. And Peter still has a remarkable memory of each student.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Drucker's former students were on hand to join him and his wife Doris to celebrate his 92nd birthday.
Okay. Congratulations and happy birthday and many more.
A few weeks later, Drucker was honored by his peers from the International Management Association.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. This is very great honor. Thank you.
For most elderly professors, such recognition might be enough. But for Peter Drucker, life would not be worth living without a new idea, a new article, or a new book.
I'm a writer. Basically, the one thing I know I can do and do well is to write. If I don't write for any length of time, I began to suffer severe withdrawal symptoms.
I think part of what has kept Peter so fresh and so relevant and so vital over time is that Peter takes in enormous amounts of information from all sorts of people, most particularly, I think, for many years, including the students in his executive education programs at Claremont, who were a continual source of the real stuff for him because they were the ones who were dealing with the problems of modern organization.
Nice to see you, Joe. You came down here from North Dakota. I did, yeah. Oh, very nice.
Thanks for your letter. Thanks.
He gets, I think, more emails and more telephone calls and faxes than anybody I know. He has this little old fax machine at home, and it goes through hundreds of pages a day, and literally comes from all over the world. Some of it solicited, most of it unsolicited.
Some of the things Drucker has been thinking about lately appear in his latest book, Managing in the Next Society, published in mid-2002. Here is a sampling of the world according to Drucker.
I would say the first and most important thing to say is that society will be more important than economy. The last, make it 50 years, one could take society more or less for granted. And it was the economy stupid. It'll be the society stupid. Increasingly, power will shift to older people, partly because of their numbers, and partly because they are no longer yesterday. They represent already their new population. You have to start out with the assumption that you compete globally, even though you market only locally. And that the customer doesn't care anymore. The customer is not distance conscious. And now you have another transformation in which the shift is from control by ownership to control by strategy, with the growth being increasingly through alliances and joint ventures and minority partnerships and outsourcing.
For more than 60 years, Peter Drucker has been analyzing where society is heading and how organizations should respond. His unique insight derives from a deep knowledge and understanding of history.
And I think the strength of my work is precisely that it is grounded in history. I look to history to illustrate today or to anticipate tomorrow.
When Drucker wrote a memoir, he called it Adventures of a Bystander. His upbringing in Europe and his long career as a lone practitioner have given him a unique observation post.
I've always compared myself to the fireman in the theater who stands in the wings and sees the play, but is not part of it. And he knows a good deal more about the play than anybody else. But he sees it very differently from either the actors or the audience.
There isn't anybody like Drucker, and I don't know how there could be anybody in the future like Drucker. He's one of a kind.
Through his writings, through his moral suasion, through his great skill as an explainer, through his exhortations, through his practical advice, he has made a difference in the lives of people.
What makes him a classic is that he noticed the important enduring things about organizations and how they work well together.
I mean, when anybody thinks about the discipline or the practice or the theory or the study of management, professional business management, they're going to think about Peter Drucker.